An idea. Oh dear.
Alex, if I had to describe Newscast, I'd say it's a visualized podcast, which means it's a podcast, it's a radio program, and it's a TV show. And our subject material is what's going on at Westminster and beyond.
Oh, it's a podcast, TV, radio show. Fine, as long as there's interesting news chat. You know, no silly gimmicks or pop culture references.
Oh, and I think today I'll give my long-awaited verdict on the Taylor Swift album.
Oh, really, nobody wants to hear you talking about that. Okay, just move on.
I'm sure everyone will be waiting with bated breath, Adam. So, I mean, other stuff that we've got in there, back to the politics, of course. We've got Louise Haigh, the Shadow Transport Secretary, who's doing this big announcement about what Labour would do with the railways. So that's going to be pretty big. We'll talk about that.
Okay, so presumably it's all just serious then, and no silly gimmicks, and no comedians on the show?
And then we'll be lightening the mood because Michael Spicer, the guy who became famous for those Other Room videos, but who's now got his own podcast on BBC Sounds and Radio 4, is going to be in this room.
Right. It's the room next door, not the other room.
Anyway, what could possibly go wrong on this episode of Newscast?
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
Hello, it's Alex in the studio.
You can tell there is an election in the air because the party leaders, in this case today, Keir Starmer of Labour, are doing kind of big flagship policies that sort of have a feeling of boldness around them, but are also, like, as they say in the trade, really retail, that you can sort of relate to your own life. And in this case, it was Labour's plans for what to do about the railways.
Yeah, big announcement. And you also know there's an election in the air because they're off around the country somewhere making said big announcements. And
in places where they might need to win seats.
In places where they might need to win seats, yeah. So that's exactly what Keir Starmer's been doing today. And he's been talking about what Labour would do with the railways. And that is effectively, over a period of time, bring them back into public control. And Labour says that would make them run a whole lot better.
And there wouldn't be like a big bang where suddenly British Rail is back. It would be that as the existing rail franchises, which are run by commercial operations, as they come to an end, they'd be taken over by a publicly owned company or the Department of Transport or basically the government.
Yeah, and Labour are saying that would take about 5 years to bring all of those existing franchises back under public control. And they're talking about the impact that would have on like reliability and, you know, just general railway service.
Although there is a bit of a kind of plot twist, but I'm trying to come up with a railway version of that.
Like a leaf on the line?
Leaf on Labour's line. Yeah.
Is that terrible?
It's the usual quality of Newscast. Let's put it that way. The leaf on the line for Labour when it comes to this is that the government is actually doing a sort of version of this already. Anyway, so to give us his analysis, here is Chris Mason, who was with Keir Starmer in the northeast of England today.
Hello newscasters from Newton Aycliffe in County Durham, the home of Hitachi train factory. You know what, this is the week where I really think politics has notched up yet again. We had 3 days in a row with news conferences from the Prime Minister. Monday in London on Rwanda, Tuesday on defence in Warsaw, Wednesday also on defence and various other things in Berlin. Here I am in the northeast of England, having been talking to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, about their ideas. So we've had defence from the Prime Minister and then transport from Labour today. And this idea of the railways pretty much going back into public ownership. Not entirely, but pretty much. Quite a chunky policy idea from Labour, and also one that they think will matter to millions of people if they can prove and convince people it would actually make a difference when you're buying a ticket or trying to get from A to B on the train. So, yep, the local elections and mayoral elections and police and crime commissioner elections in England and Wales just a week away. That explains some of the notching up of politics. Oh, and then the general election as well. Imminent now, whenever it comes. When will it come? Well, we don't quite know, but politics certainly reflecting the fact that polling stations are getting closer.
So that was Chris giving his analysis of the situation while sitting on a salt/grit bin. So to expand on some of those things, we've been speaking to Louise Haigh, who is Labour's Shadow Transport Secretary, and she's just sitting on a normal chair. Louise, hello.
Hello.
So give us your vision. If there's a Labour government, it's a few years hence, Great British Railways is up and running. Why will the rail network be so much better, and how will it feel as a passenger?
Well, our reforms are based on the fact that the current system isn't working at all. And it doesn't work because it doesn't work in the interest of the passenger. That's why we've set out a really detailed plan today that will reform our railways top to bottom so that they are incentivised exclusively to work in the interest of the passenger. So we're abolishing Network Rail, we will establish Great British Railways, and we will bring all the private operators into public ownership. And that means we'll bring together decisions around track and train. And that means that when we invest hard-pressed taxpayers' money into our railways, then it will deliver improvements for passengers. At the moment, we have a crazy situation where billions of pounds can be spent. For example, £4 billion was recently spent on the East Coast Main Line upgrade. But because those decisions are made separately from operations, it's had absolutely no impact on passenger service whatsoever. So having a publicly owned and publicly controlled rail network will improve reliability, it will improve performance, it will improve the implications of infrastructure spending, and we will be able to hold Great British Railways to account on behalf of the passenger, so we drive up customer service levels as well.
Louise, hi, it's Alex here. I guess what a lot of people just want to know, is it going to make the tickets any cheaper?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I can't today promise to cut fares. They are incredibly complex, and they are based in regulation that needs reform. And it would be completely insincere if I, as you know, in opposition, start saying, you know, the Chippenham to Woking will now cost £3 less. But what we can commit to is a simplification of the fare system, because one of the biggest things that keeps passengers off the railway is that they just don't trust that they're not being fleeced. So we have a situation at the moment where, say, for example, Sheffield to Manchester will cost one price, but if you buy that journey broken down, Sheffield to Buxton and then Buxton to Manchester, then it will cost less. And people just feel they're being fleeced. So what we have
Louise,
said is
but I get that already. When I go on Trainline to buy a train ticket, it then says, do you want to split save this journey? And it buys me 2 different tickets. That already happens.
Yeah, exactly. If you buy through Trainline, but obviously not everyone does buy through Trainline. If you're buying direct from an operator, or if you're trying to navigate through different systems, then there is every chance that you're being fleeced in the current system. So we will deliver a best fare guarantee, just like people experience with Transport for London, or indeed if they buy through Trainline. You know, there is a reason I announced these reforms at Trainline this morning, because they're a really good example of the private sector in the railways that's trying to innovate, that's trying to do the right thing by passengers, but has been completely frustrated by the broken system. So they've developed digital season tickets, but they've only been able to negotiate them with certain operators. For 70% of the network, they're not available, despite the Secretary of State for Transport stepping in and asking operators to introduce them. That's because the system is so dysfunctional. Whereas we would want to we would task Great British Railways with working with innovators like Trainline to make sure that where they have things that are better for the passenger, they can be rolled across the network speedily and available for all passengers.
No, the government has already said that they're going to set up Great British Railways, and there's a thing called the Great British Railways Transition Group, which is actually already setting up their version of Great British Railways. Is your version going to be different?
Fundamentally different. I mean, first of all, the Tories recognised that reform was necessary 5 years ago, and they've made basically no progress since. They've not passed the legislation that is needed. They've spent hundreds of millions of pounds on talking about it, and since that time, there's been no progress. In fact, there's been decline on major areas of the network. Our Great British Railways obviously is fundamentally different, because it will cover the public ownership of operations as well, completely reducing the fragmentation and waste that plagues the current system and would plague the Tories version as well. But the Great British Railways transition team that you mentioned sits within Network Rail. And this is a really important differentiation, because Network Rail is the infrastructure operator, and it doesn't deliver at the moment. Its performance is not as good as it should be, and it has a culture that is very engineer-led. That's exactly the kind of culture that plagued British Rail as well. And that's why we want our Great British Railways and our railways to be fundamentally different. to be working single-mindedly on behalf of the passenger. So we're abolishing Network Rail and we're establishing the new body that will take over those functions, but it will be led by people who are exclusively focused on passenger outcomes.
Louise, I was interested in the document that you published today about improving the passenger experience and things like making sure the toilets are cleaner and making sure the Wi-Fi works. What's your theory about why train Wi-Fi is so rubbish? Because if you want to fix it, you must have a theory for why it's so bad.
There's a number of reasons, and it's partly because the system isn't incentivized to deliver for customer experience, and that's why we've talked about those things. So I get the train obviously twice a week between Sheffield and London, and there is no Wi-Fi or phone reception on that whole journey. And part of the reason, if you can believe it, is that the film on the windows repels some of the signal and makes it more difficult.
True?
No way. You love trains too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I always thought the part of the reason that the Wi-Fi was so sketchy and the signal drops out was just because, like, if you're going through, on a train real quick, it like jumps from Wi-Fi supplier to Wi-Fi supplier.
No, it's just the windows are too dark.
Is that how it works?
No, I mean, on some operators and in some parts of the country, obviously, I mean, there's an issue obviously with broadband and 5G generally across the country, but on some operators is excellent. On LNER, it's really consistent. On Northern, it's really consistent, and there is a particular issue with the way that the trains have been procured on certain lines.
Let me just ask you one thing. So obviously this is one of the things that's kind of stayed in Labour's plan, this idea to bring the railways back under public control, where a lot of other stuff that, to be fair, Keir Starmer said, back when he was going to be leader of the party, that he was going to do, a lot of that's been ditched already. Did you have to fight for this in the shadow cabinet? Did you have to say, look, I definitely want to keep this? Did you face any opposition from your shadow cabinet colleagues?
As we develop policies, there's always robust challenge, a robust discussion, and there's been an awful lot of work, and as you can imagine, industry engagement as we've developed these plans. And of course, there's been opposition from people within industry as well, and lobbying from outside the party. So we've had to make sure that they are really, really credible, really, really sensible. And I'm delighted that today it has led the news and it's captured people's imaginations, and people are really excited about it. It is a popular policy, but it is. Importantly, within our fiscal rules, you will know them very well. Rachel Reeves has articulated them, as has every member of the Labour front bench many, many times. But they are within our fiscal rules because we can take the contracts back as they expire, so we won't have to pay any money in compensation. And then, as we've set out, we actually think that we can deliver significant savings to the taxpayer because the model is so inefficient. Whereas in other sectors like water, where I know people are really anxious and keen for us to nationalise, it would cost the taxpayer billions and billions of pounds. And when resources are so scarce at the moment, we think the better and more pragmatic thing to do very quickly is to bring in legislation and regulation of those water companies and criminal sanctions of directors that allow dumping of sewage into our waters. So I think it's, all of these demonstrate that where the settlement is failing, we're prepared to take bold action, but we have to do it in a way that is credible and respectful of taxpayers' money.
You talk about people providing challenge and disagreeing, and one of those people is the current Transport Secretary, Mark Harper. Here's what he said about your plans.
It's an unfunded plan that they've got. They've got no idea how to pay for it. And also, the other thing I think, there's nothing in it that's going to improve services for passengers. The other thing that people need to understand is what the damage that will be done by Angela Rayner's plan to reverse all our trade union legislation. You're going to go back to French-style wildcat strikes with no notice.
Let me ask you, because he was talking there about, the unions. Obviously, one of the big problems on the railways at the moment, Louise, is the ongoing industrial action. Have you got a plan to sort it out?
I mean, what a cheek of Mark Harper to talk about encouraging industrial action when we're into the second year of the first national strike on our railways in over 30 years. These have been deliberately provoked by Tory Transport Secretaries, starting from Grant Shapps. And it's not just me saying that, but rail industry sources and employers that have said it as well. So it might sound basic, but unfortunately, it's not it has not been basic because the current Tory Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, has not sat down with the unions in more than 18 months. He's not been round the negotiating table. He's not shifted the mandate for the operators. He's actually, we think, told the rail delivery group that negotiates with the unions not to negotiate any further either. So he has been deliberately provoking this, prolonging this, because he thinks that it's a good excuse because the trains aren't running on time and as a good distraction from his failures. So first, it would be my first priority to resolve this dispute and to get round the table. And I think we could find a compromise. It wouldn't necessarily mean an increased pay deal because there are other conditions and reforms on the table, and I'm confident that we could find it. Just as Labour-run Wales did, they avoided any strike action on their railways. They found a compromise that didn't break the bank and included some workplace modernisation, but they did it in social partnership and not in the antagonistic way that this government has repeatedly treated working people.
In that clip there, Mark Harper mentioned Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader. She stood in for Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions this week, and she described Rishi Sunak as a pint-sized loser. Are we really in a place where it's okay to take the mickey out of someone's height now?
I think, Angela Rayner has been called many, many things herself by the Conservatives.
Yeah, which is bad. So that doesn't mean it's right for her to do.
I'm sure she could have thought of much worse. Look, it was a light-hearted jibe. I'm sure Rishi doesn't take it particularly personally. I think it's the cut and thrust of Prime Minister's Questions, and I think she really held her own in the face of some pretty full-on attacks from the Tories herself.
And last one for me, and it's a bit of a curveball. There's a clip has gone viral in the last few days of your colleague Darren Jones, who's the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, on a radio station panel show where he doesn't know the answer to a question. And instead of blagging it, he goes, "Oh, I don't know the answer to that." And then a few minutes later, he gets a text from Labour HQ and he gets his phone out and says, "Oh, here's what I meant to say to you." And he then says it. Does that mean the era of politicians blagging is kind of over now?
Well, I was on Any Questions with Alex a little while ago, and I was asked a question by the audience, and I did exactly the same. I think there's some areas of policy that are so specific, or answers so specific, that there's no way to blag your way out. I think people would far rather hear you say you don't know than try and blag it. As long as you not saying you don't know to absolutely everything, then you just look like a muppet.
That, to be fair, that was a very specific point of agricultural policy about the
Thank you, Alex. It was a very specific point.
It was for non-avid Any Questions newscasters. There you go.
And that is where we will end the Any Questions Love-In. Louise Haigh, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Now, Alex, while we were recording that chat with the Shadow Transport Secretary, there was some updating news from the really quite volatile political situation in Scotland, where this morning the SNP ripped up their power sharing agreement with the Scottish Greens. So they're now going to run as a minority government. But it's got all sorts of implications, hasn't it?
Yeah, this is massive. So they've had this cooperation agreement between the SNP and the Green Party in Scotland since 2021, where they agree to work together on certain things. And some of the Green Party MSPs have got positions in the Scottish Government, hold roles, Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvey, who are the co-leaders of Scottish Greens. But there has been some dispute between the SNP and the Greens in Scotland for a while. And the most recent thing they've really disagreed over is the fact the SNP government said they were going to row back on some of their climate commitments. That's to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. They said they weren't going to meet it, so they're going to row back. So that really annoyed the Greens. So there was this question about whether they could continue to work together. And before that question was resolved, because the Scottish Greens were going to go away and talk to their party about it, Humza Yousaf, who is the First Minister in Scotland, pulled out of that cooperation agreement and said, you know what, hang on, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I think it's pretty fair to say it left the leaders of the Green Party in Scotland pretty angry because they were pulled into a meeting Thursday morning with Humza Yousaf and told, no, we're not working with you anymore. Basically dumped. So that left them pretty angry.
It's not me, it's you.
You got it. And what we were just hearing on our phones while we were talking to Louise Haigh about trains is that actually there's going to be this vote next week about whether or not the Scottish Parliament's got confidence in Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, and the Greens have said that they are not going to say they've got confidence in, so they're going to support that no confidence vote. So that's quite a big deal, which raises a question mark over Humza Yousaf and his future. So really big, volatile moves going on.
Do you know what it's selfishly making me think? Back to my time as a young political journalist at Westminster. It makes you realise...
years ago.
Well, it kind of was now. yet again, the Lib Dem Tory coalition after the 2010 election was remarkably stable as far as British politics goes.
It was.
Because actually, any other time it happens, it doesn't last for very long.
No, it was, because it lasted the whole term, didn't it? And they had thrashed out a lot of their differences in the Quad. Remember the Quad, which was the kind of four people, the Lib Dems and Danny Alexander? Remember him?
Although also part of me think, and of course this is epic and massive, and it's like a moment in Scottish politics, but you've got to remember, like, there has been an SNP minority administration before, and that survived quite a long time, and they did do stuff. And actually, is it just that the agreements that were internal to the SNP and the Scottish Greens, but still managed to sort of work for a bit, those disagreements just become external ones, and ultimately they still get stuff done. And we will pick up that amazing story in a lot more detail on tomorrow's podcast episode of Newscast, which will be available on BBC Sounds. Right, shall we invite Michael Spicer from his room into our room?
Let's do it.
And Michael Spicer is here to mark the fact that his BBC Radio 4 podcast, No Room, is available now on BBC Sounds. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
And congratulations, because it's very funny.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you listened.
Is that awkward when people say that to you? Like, oh, it's very funny. And you're like, yeah, I know.
No, I do like compliments wherever I can get them.
Good. What, for people who haven't listened to it yet, like, what's the elevator pitch?
Basically, if you enjoy what I do online, then you'll enjoy this. So I've made a living for the last sort of 4 or 5 years doing sketch comedy online. And Radio 4 have been extremely nice and courteous and said, you should probably do that with us. So that's what I'm doing. So it's a mixture of what I've been doing online and character comedy and some topical sketches too.
How have you found the move from doing it online to doing it for something like Radio 4?
The only thing that's different is that I have to do voices now.
You are good at the voices, I would say.
Because whereas before, when I've recorded stuff for Radio 4, we go to a recording studio and just do the series in 2 or 3 days. And this time I'm just at home and I'm recording however I want, whenever I want. So I'm doing a sketch. If I'm doing a sketch about somebody who's doing a social media post, then I will record it on my phone.
Oh, really?
If I'm doing a sketch where I'm on Zoom, then I go on a fake Zoom and record myself on the Zoom. So you've got that sort of Zoomy sound to it.
So you're doing it yourself. You're actually recording it yourself at home. It's not kind of studio-based, pre-scripted, and then you come in and do it.
No. So I do it all at home. And then I've got a very talented producer, Matt Tiller, who puts it all together, and a talented composer, Augustine Bousfield, who's created these amazing soundscapes, to put it all together. So it's the 3 of us working together.
And what's your inspiration for your content? Because I've listened to there's 2 episodes currently out on BBC Sounds, with another 8 to come on Sounds, and then it goes on Radio 4. The ones I've listened to, you've got in each episode of 15 minutes, you've got a whole range of material in that episode.
That's right.
So how do you come up with it? Do you just sit there and consume news and think, haha, that could be funny? Or, I mean, because they go from, I don't know, quite like, there's one about the local elections. There's like a moment in there where you're kind of interviewing a councillor and his name's wrong. Yeah. Just puts me in mind of my actual day-to-day life in quite a depressing fashion. But, where does that inspiration come from? Yeah,
that comes from, I mean, I don't really absorb the news, because I find that a slightly depressing thing to do. No offence.
Yes, but, it's kind of what we do for a living.
Yeah, you've got to find a limit, I think. And I think what really opened my eyes was when I joined Twitter and I got this feed of like a mixture of different people all with different opinions on the news, rather than just a sort of generic news feed. And it kind of shaped how I felt about politics and news. And that was my springboard. Social media was my springboard. Because without that, you wouldn't have got, like, for instance, James Cleverly making a fool of himself, not knowing where he was or who he was talking to when he was going on a tour with a local councillor. So that's what kind of inspires me. Is I know it's called doom scrolling, really, isn't it? But I do like to get my filter through my phone, really. But there are just occasionally there'll be things that are not necessarily political or news related, that are just sort of cultural, that I just think, that's a bit cliched, I could parody that sort of thing. So I try and get my inspiration from all
One of the sketches was very close to home for me because it's a news presenter. I said they're in a war zone, which I don't do, but they break into the war coverage to talk about Taylor Swift's new album.
Yep.
So you can see why that really spoke to me.
Yes.
Welcome back to the news at 5. We're live from the front line as the bombing campaign begins in earnest. More news on that later, but first this hour, Taylor Swift's new album has dropped today. I'm joined by music journalist Gunther Bailey. Gunther, thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
You've listened to the album. What do you make of it? Is she back to her bouncy best, or is this another thoughtful outing for the undisputed queen of pop?
Sorry, are you all right?
Yes, I'm fine. What's your take on the new album? Is she back to her bouncy best?
Yeah, but this album is more a blend of different styles and moments from her past, all coming together to provide a rich, melancholic and ethereal paroxysm of a beautifully healing musical ephemera. Flipping.
I'm afraid I didn't get all of that, Gunther. I've just been shot in the leg. In a nutshell, are Swifties going to be happy tonight?
You don't have to cover a story like this, you know. You are a news channel. You don't have to be the one show.
Well, next time I want advice from a 47-year-old man whose entire personality is to pretend to like everything on Radio 1 in a desperate attempt to stay relevant, I'll know who to come to. Gunther Bailey, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks very much. I hope you get shot in your other leg.
I have.
Good.
The irony being actually that would be my take on that album. So, I mean, it just worked on so many levels there.
Well, that is a poke at music journalism as well. I'm trying to cover all bases.
Everyone gets it there. But I just wonder, like, I listen to that and it makes me think, oh, is the news, the format kind of a bit broken? Because that is what happens on the news. And actually, do we need to think of something different?
Well, I think it's probably maybe symptomatic of news channels to turn itself into a magazine or give itself a magazine brief. But because of that, if you do fly a newsreader out to a war zone, that means that they can't be that all-encompassing newsreader anymore. But those rules haven't been set yet, so that's why we have those kind of moments.
You've created an existential crisis in that, Michael. Thank you.
Well, whatever I can do to help.
Anyway, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Now, Alex, I noticed you took a week off. Any questions the other week?
Mm-hmm.
Were you in New York by any chance?
I wasn't, sadly. No, I was in Devon. It doesn't quite, I know, but still beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, I know where I'd rather go. Anyway, if you had been in New York and you were in Times Square and you happened to look up, you would have seen my dear, dear friend Katja Adler's podcast, The Global Story, being advertised in Times Square.
No.
Yes. So congratulations to her. That's the big time.
Massive. Really, really big.
I am slightly jealous, though. So then I thought, what could we do instead? And I thought, why don't we get newscasters to take photos of themselves in iconic locations or even non-iconic locations near them, but holding up the Newscast logo so we can have like our own version. So we're putting up the Newscast logo on screen right now if you want to screen grab it with one of your devices. Or if you go to our Discord server, the links of which are sort of scattered all over the place, we will put up a high-res version of the Newscast artwork so you can download it onto your device. And then you need to just go somewhere meaningful to you and take a picture of yourself with the Newscast logo.
I am fascinated by what this is going to bring in.
Please don't go anywhere unsafe, though. Like, I don't want anyone, like, climbing up a derelict building.
This is like that kind of newscast version of when people take a teddy bear around and do it, like, in front of the Eiffel Tower or in front of, like, the, Leaning Tower of Pisa.
And if you just happen to find yourself, I don't know, in Times Square, more is the better. And then you can send us your pictures. You can email them to us, newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on 0330 123 9480, and I'll be super chuffed if anyone actually does that. So please do. So thank you very much. Alex, thanks for keeping me company.
Pleasure as ever.
And that's it for this episode of Newscast. There will be another one along very soon. Bye.
Newscast. Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Well done.
It's with